Hello and welcome to Module 4, Learning Objective 3. In this objective, we're going to explain the components to GDP and work with those just a little bit. Okay, so from the YouTube video, you found out that there are 4 components to GDP. One is consumption, and that's usually by households. Investment is similar to what we looked at in the factor of production, capital. So that would be anything used to produce a good or a service. Government purchases, and then net exports, which are just simply our exports minus our imports. And for the United States, because we have a trade deficit, this is usually, NX is usually negative, and because we import far more than what we export. These slides just basically explain each of these components of GDP. The first one being consumption. Again, when we look at consumption, that's primarily what we looked at in our first model of the circular flow, and that's spending by households on goods and services. This would be everything from durable, non-durable goods, and again, you will see coming up or have seen the Bureau of Economic Analysis breakdown of GDP, and they do break consumption down into several subcategories. One of the points that I wanted to make was that housing costs, obviously if you're a renter, then your rent payments are included. If you own your home, though, or are purchasing it with the help of a bank, then what happens is we would like to think about, could you rent that home out or rent a portion of it out to another individual to allow you to increase your revenues? And so that's why we include the imputed rental value of a house, but not the purchase price, so don't think about that in GDP, and also not the mortgage payments. The imputed rental value goes off the state estimated value, or SEV, which many of you are aware is what your taxes are based upon. When we talk about investment, investment is spending on the goods that will be used in the future. And here's the key word, is to produce more goods. So much like capital that we talked about earlier, these things are in place to allow us to produce goods and services. And so it would be, if I am a farmer, the tractor that I have, the barn that I have, that would be an example of structure. Inventories would be our work in process. And if you remember from other business classes, perhaps it's input, process, output. Well, we don't count inventories because they're not in their finished state. Remember, the final market value of all goods and services, and when we talk about the goods and services, we mean the final product. We don't want to double count them. Many people mistake the word investment. This is one of those words economists use differently to think about things like financial assets and bonds. So I really want you to make sure that you understand that that's not what we mean here. In fact, what we mean are things that we use to produce goods and services. Government purchases is one that's kind of interesting. And if we look at government purchases, the government, in terms of just making the government run, and or lack thereof in any government shutdown, they're a pretty big purchaser of all kinds of things. Think about the paper and computers and all of those kinds of things, especially when you look at schools and all of the things that they would purchase to ensure that a school can run. One of the things that it doesn't include are any kind of transfer payments, and this might be the first time that you've seen this idea of transfer payments. But transfer payments are those payments that you get, but you're not giving the government anything in return. There's no circular process back and forth. So examples of that would be Social Security, unemployment, aid to dependent families and children. So all of those would be transfer payments, and we do not include those in government purchases because there's not a corresponding input on the household side that would account for those government purchases. So those are not included in GDP. Net exports, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, in terms of the United States, we import far more than we export. So our net exports are usually negative, and what that means is that we have a trade deficit because we purchase more from other countries than what we sell. We do still sell a lot to other countries, and when you look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis website, that's something to kind of look at, the difference between the imports and exports. It's not that great because we still do produce a lot of things. So what we get to is the expenditure approach, or the expenditure equation down here, that GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus net exports. This slide's a little bit dated, but it just looks at the U.S. GDP and its components. After this is over, I also will take you to that Bureau of Economic Analysis. I think it's the next component in the module. Okay, let's try our hand at this idea, and I'm just going to go ahead and write up the GDP equation up here, and we'll take each one and see what we think is going to happen. So again, GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports, and net exports being exports minus imports. Okay? So here we have our first question. Debbie spends $300 to buy her husband dinner at the finest restaurants. So let's think about which component would be affected and then what would happen to GDP overall. Well, if Debbie is spending $300 to buy her husband dinner, she's in consumption. So we're going to increase consumption by $300. And likewise, we're going to increase GDP by $300. So that's the answer to A. I'm going to go ahead and erase that. And then we look at the next question. It says Sarah spends $1,200 on a new laptop to use in her publishing business. The laptop was built in China. Well, there's kind of two answers to this one. One would say, well, it doesn't affect GDP. But that's not really what the question's asking us. It's asking us which categories would be impacted. And so let's go ahead and go back to our equation. And she's spending $1,200 on a new laptop to use in her publishing business. So that would be investment. And so investment would increase by $200. Or $1,200, excuse me. Then, because she imported it from China, and remember imports are a negative, we would have a $1,200 here, which means then that GDP would not be impacted. The investment that she made would offset the import from the laptop. Let's go ahead and look at the next one. And in the next one, Jane spends $800 to use on a computer to use in her editing business. She got last year's model on sale for a great price from a local manufacturer. Well, again, there's kind of two ways to look at this one too. The net effect means no effect in GDP. But let's look at it the first way. You could say that, hey, this is last year's model and GDP is only the current year, so there you go. We don't have to do anything. And that is a good answer. Another possible answer is you could say, well, that model computer might have been sitting in someone's inventory. She is likewise going to use it in her publishing business. So you might say we increase consumption by $800 and we decrease investment by $800. This is not the best answer. I think the first answer is the better one. But if you were to explain this, if you wrote it on a test, I would count that in your favor. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the next one, D. D says General Motors buys $500 million worth of cars, but consumers only buy $470 million worth of them. So what do we have? Well, if consumers are spending $470 million, we're going to put $470 million increase here. And then, because they didn't sell $30 million, we're going to put that into our inventories. So that's going to go in the investment category, which means GDP is going to increase $500 million, the 470 plus the 30. Okay. And then the next slides just simply check our answers. Okay, so we did pretty well on those. If you have any questions to them, please don't hesitate to contact me. And that concludes Module for Learning Objective 3, explain the components to GDP. Thanks.